Odysseus, king of Ithaca, has been praised for centuries as a symbol of cunning and fortitude. But what if this image is just a convenient mask? Behind his epic deeds lies a chain of cruel acts that myths prefer to ignore. Today, we will delve into the forgotten details to reveal how Odysseus used his power not for noble purposes, but to assert his tyranny. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and let's get started. Beware of the Danaans bearing gifts. These words of Virgil have become famous, but behind them lies not just a warning, but the shadow of one man whose ingenuity turned into genocide. 10 years of siege. For 10 years, the Achaeans trampled the ground at the walls of Troy, losing their best warriors. Victory was nowhere in sight. And then, when despair had almost broken the spirit of the Greeks, Odysseus, king of Ithaca, proposed a plan. Not a display of military valor, but an act of pure, cold calculation. His idea did not involve fair combat. It was based on deception, on playing with the faith and hope of the Trojans. Imagine the morning at the walls of the great city. The Achaean camp is empty. On the shore, where thousands of tents stood yesterday, stands a giant wooden figure of a horse, dedicated, as the inscription says, to the goddess Athena. For the war-weary Trojans, it was a sign that the gods were on their side, and the enemy had fled. But inside this wooden womb, in the stifling darkness, Odysseus and his select warriors sat holding their breath. They could not hear the jubilation outside, only the creaking of the wood and the beating of their own hearts. The Trojan horse was not just a military ruse. It was a symbol of total destruction, made possible by one man. When the warriors emerged from the horse at night and opened the city gates, it was not a battle that began, but a massacre. The Trojans, celebrating their victory, were taken by surprise. The city that could not be taken by force fell because of deception.
Odysseus did not just win the war. He wiped Troy off the face of the earth. The men were killed, the women and children enslaved. Temples were desecrated, houses burned down. This was not the victory of a warrior, but the triumph of a tyrant for whom the end justified absolutely any means, including the destruction of an entire people. 20 years of absence. For 20 years, Penelope, Odysseus' wife, fended off the advances of the noble young men of Ithaca and the neighboring islands. They feasted in his house, squandered his wealth, and demanded that the queen choose a new husband. The return of Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, was supposed to be a moment of justice. But what happened next went far beyond necessary defense. Odysseus does not simply punish his offenders. He stages an exemplary massacre. Locking all the exits from the banquet hall, he, together with his son Telemachus and 2 loyal servants, begins the methodical extermination of 108 people. This is not a duel, not a battle between equals. It is the execution of unarmed people trapped in a trap. Imagine this scene. The hall, recently filled with laughter and music, turns into a slaughterhouse. The suitors, deprived of weapons, which Telemachus had hidden in advance, rush about in panic. They beg for mercy, offer ransom, but Odysseus is deaf to their pleas. Arrow after arrow, he hits his targets. Homer describes this in frightening detail. Blood floods the floor, corpses pile up on top of each other. Odysseus acts not as a king regaining his throne, but as an executioner reveling in his power and revenge. He leaves no one alive, demonstrating that his will is the only law on Ithaca. After the last of the suitors was killed, the wave of violence did not stop. Odysseus turned his gaze to those who were weakest, the maidservants of his own house. 12 of them, according to the king, had betrayed him by having affairs with the suitors. Perhaps they were forced. Perhaps they were simply trying to survive in a house where the master had been absent for 20 years and strangers had seized power. But that did not matter to Odysseus. He did not listen to their excuses. He showed not a shred of compassion. His order was cold and cruel. First, he forced the unfortunate women to carry the corpses of their lovers out of the hall and wash the blood from the floors. It was a humiliation that preceded death. And then he gave the order to his son Telemachus. Telemachus, wanting to please his father, decides that a simple death by sword is too clean for them. He stretches a ship's rope between two posts, throws 12 nooses over it, and hangs all the maids together. Homer describes how they twitched their legs a little, but not for long. This scene is one of the darkest in the Odyssey. It shows not just cruelty, but a tyrannical desire for complete control, where even the slightest disobedience or infidelity is punished by a painful and humiliating death. Thus, the hero, praised for his intelligence and fortitude, turns out to be a ruler who asserts his power through fear and ruthless violence. His return to Ithaca is not a story of restoring order, but a chronicle of the establishment of tyranny, where the price of loyalty is life and the price of betrayal is a painful death. The shadow of the Trojan horse fell not only on the ruined city, it followed Odysseus, becoming his invisible companion on the long journey home. This shadow manifested itself in his decisions, in his attitude towards people, both enemies and allies. The entire Odyssey of the King of Ithaca is not just a journey, but a continuous demonstration that the methods used at the walls of Troy have become second nature to him. He has learned to see people not as individuals, but as tools for achieving his goals, as pieces on a chessboard that can be sacrificed without the slightest hesitation. His first encounter after sailing from Troy with the Cicones, inhabitants of the Thracian city of Ismarus, sets the tone for the rest of the narrative. It was not a forced stop or an act of self-defense. It was pure piracy. Odysseus and his men attacked the city, plundered it, killed the men, and divided the women and treasures among themselves. Homer describes this matter-of-factly as the natural right of the victors. But therein lies the horror. For Odysseus, who had just finished a great war, looting and killing civilians was not a tragedy, but a routine way to replenish supplies. He acted not as a king returning home, but as the leader of a gang of marauders. It was his greed and inability to stop his men, who were reveling in wine and easy prey, that led to the counterattack by the Cicones. As a result, Odysseus lost 6 men from each of his 12 ships. 72 warriors died not in a heroic battle, but because of the banal greed of their leader. This episode is not an accident, but a pattern. Odysseus constantly puts the lives of his men at risk for dubious gain or to satisfy his own curiosity. The same pattern of behavior is repeated in the land of the Lotophagi. Here the threat was not physical but existential. Those who ate the lotus forgot their homeland and wished to remain in blissful oblivion. Odysseus's decision to save his men seems noble, but look closely at his methods. He does not persuade them or appeal to their honor or duty. He orders his men to drag their intoxicated companions onto the ships and tie them to the benches. He treats them not as comrades, but as disobedient cattle, as objects to be transported from point A to point B. There is no humanity in this act of salvation, only the cold pragmatism of a commander who does not want to lose members of his squad. He saves their bodies, but completely ignores their will, even if it is clouded. But the most striking example of his tyrannical nature and boundless selfishness is the story of the Cyclops Polyphemus. Yes, Polyphemus was a man-eating monster, and escape from his cave was a necessity. The cunning of Odysseus, who called himself Nobody, and his plan to blind the Cyclops are classics of the genre. But what happens next completely changes the perception of this myth. Already safe on the ship, at a safe distance from the shore, Odysseus cannot resist the temptation. It is not enough for him to simply escape. He needs the monster to know who humiliated him. He shouts his real name to the Cyclops. "If anyone asks you, mortal, who so shamefully blinded you, answer that it was Odysseus, son of Laertes, from Ithaca." This is not just pride. It is an act of insane self-love that endangers the lives of all his men. Odysseus literally gives the enraged son of the god of the seas the exact address of his offenders. Polyphemus calls on his father Poseidon, and from that moment on, the god of the seas becomes the sworn enemy of Odysseus and his crew. All the subsequent storms, shipwrecks, and deaths are a direct consequence of this rash, selfish act. Odysseus's companions begged him to keep quiet, but he did not listen to them. His vanity proved stronger than his instinct for self-preservation and his sense of responsibility for his men. He sacrificed their future for the sake of a momentary triumph of his ego. 10 years of wandering, the loss of all ships and the entire crew. This is the price that the simple people of Ithaca paid for the pride of their king. The story of the bag of winds given to him by the god Aeolus only confirms this pattern. Odysseus receives a gift that could take him home in one fell swoop, but he does not trust his men. He does not share information with them, does not explain what is in the bag. He simply orders them not to touch it. This arouses suspicion. His companions, exhausted from sailing, decide that the king is hiding treasures from them. While he sleeps, they untie the bag. Hurricane winds break free and throw the fleet back to the island of Aeolus. Odysseus blames the crew for everything, their malice. But wasn't it his own secrecy, his inability to build trusting relationships with those who followed him to their deaths, that was the root cause of the disaster? He rules not as a leader, but as a supervisor, demanding blind obedience and not deeming it necessary to explain anything. He himself creates an atmosphere of mistrust and then punishes people for its consequences. Next come the Laestrygonians, man-eating giants. The scouts sent by Odysseus are eaten. Then the giants begin to pelt his fleet, which is moored in a convenient but enclosed bay, with rocks. They sink 11 of the 12 ships. Only Odysseus's own ship is saved, which he, showing foresight or selfishness, left outside the bay. Hundreds of his men perish before his eyes. He does not try to save them. He simply cuts the rope and hastily sails away, saving his own life and the lives of a handful of survivors. This is again cold calculation. He does not mourn his fallen comrades. He notes the loss of resources. People are expendable to him. His encounter with the sorceress Circe, is another episode that reveals his nature. She turns his men into pigs. Odysseus, with the help of the god Hermes, overcomes her spell. But what does he do after that? He becomes her lover and spends a whole year on her island in idleness and pleasure. He, the king, rushing home to his faithful wife and son, forgets everything for the sake of carnal pleasures. And only when his crew, the very people he despises and distrusts, remind him of his homeland, does he reluctantly agree to continue on his way. This year on the island of Aea is not a forced delay, but a conscious choice. A choice in favor of personal comfort and pleasure at the expense of his duty. Even his journey to the underworld, undertaken on Circe's advice, bears the mark of his egocentricity. He descends into Hades not to atone for his sins or to find peace for the souls of his fallen comrades. His goal is purely utilitarian, to obtain a prophecy from the blind Tiresias about how to return home. There he meets the shadow of his mother, Anticlea, and learns that she died of grief for him. He sees the souls of his comrades who fell at Troy, including Achilles and Ajax.
But his communication with them is superficial. He does not seek forgiveness, nor does he experience deep remorse. He gathers information. Even in the world of the dead, Odysseus remains pragmatic and manipulative. His meeting with the shadow of Ajax the Great is particularly telling. Ajax, the second-best warrior in the Achaean army after Achilles, killed himself after the armor of the fallen Achilles was awarded to Odysseus rather than to him. Odysseus's victory in this dispute was achieved not by force of arms, but by the power of words, cunning, and, as some versions of the myth suggest, vote-rigging. Ajax considered himself humiliated and insulted. In Hades, he refuses to speak to Odysseus, and his shadow silently walks away. Odysseus tries to talk to him, but his words are full of self-justification rather than remorse. He blames the gods and evil fate for everything, but not his own ambition, which led to the death of the great hero. He is incapable of admitting his guilt, even in the face of death. Sailing past the island of the Sirens, Odysseus once again demonstrates his attitude towards his crew. Wanting to hear their enchanting song and survive at the same time, he orders himself to be tied to the mast. He simply plugs his companions' ears with wax. He is the only one who gets a unique experience, risking the entire ship for the sake of his curiosity. The crew remains a faceless mass, rowers deprived even of the ability to hear. He uses them as a tool to satisfy his desire, sharing neither the risk nor the reward with them. Returning to Ithaca, Odysseus continues his game. He does not reveal himself immediately to his wife or father. He weaves a web of intrigue, testing everyone's loyalty. This suspicion may have helped him survive his wanderings, but in peaceful life it looks like the paranoia of a tyrant who trusts no one. He subjects Penelope, the woman who has been faithful to him for 20 years, to sophisticated psychological tests. He enjoys his role as a mysterious avenger, manipulating the feelings of those closest to him. The act of revenge against the suitors, as we have already seen, was excessively cruel. But the violence did not end there. After killing the suitors and maids, Odysseus faces a new problem. The relatives of the dead gather a militia to avenge their sons. A civil war breaks out on Ithaca. The conflict is only stopped by the direct intervention of the goddess Athena, who forces the parties to make peace. But what does this say about Odysseus as a ruler? His return did not bring peace and prosperity. It brought carnage and divided his own kingdom. He was unable to resolve the conflict through diplomacy or law. His only response to any problem was violence. Later, non-Homeric myths paint an even darker portrait. In some of them, Odysseus is portrayed as the man responsible for the death of the innocent Astyanax, Hector's young son. It was he who insisted that the child be thrown from the walls of Troy so that Priam's line would be broken forever. This was a cold-blooded, calculated murder of a child, for which there is no military justification. There is also a myth about his inglorious death. Tiresias's prophecy stated that death would come to him from the sea. According to one version, Odysseus was killed by his own son, Telegonus, born to Circe, whom he did not recognize. Telegonus landed on Ithaca in search of his father and fatally wounded Odysseus in a skirmish with a spear tipped with a stingray's tail. It is symbolic that the tyrant, who built his life on deception and violence, dies at the hands of his own son, who did not recognize him. His death becomes the final act of tragic misunderstanding and fate, which he brought upon himself with his vanity in the story of Polyphemus. Thus, if we strip Odysseus of the gilding of heroic myth, we are left with a complex and frightening figure. This is a man for whom lying is a natural state and violence is the main tool for solving problems. His mind serves not wisdom but cunning. His steadfastness is not the persistence in achieving a noble goal, but the stubbornness of an egoist who walks over others. He is a survivor, but the price of this survival is the lives of all his comrades, the peace of an entire city, and the tranquility of his own kingdom. Odysseus is not so much a hero as a tragic anti-hero, an eternal wanderer who, on his long journey home, lost not only his companions and ships, but also his own humanity. His story is a warning about how easily the mind can become a weapon of tyranny, and the thirst for life can turn into indifference to the death of others. But the shadow of the Trojan horse was longer than the journey from the ruined city to Ithaca. It stretched back into the past long before the first Achaean ship touched Trojan sand. Odysseus' cruelty and cynicism were not acquired in the crucible of war. They were an innate part of his nature, honed by years of intrigue even in peaceful Greece. The myth of his call to war is not a story of patriotic fervor, but the first act in a long drama of manipulation. When Menelaus and Agamemnon gathered the Achaean kings for the campaign against Troy, Odysseus was not eager to join. He had been given a prophecy that if he went on the campaign, he would return home only after 20 years, alone and unrecognized. The king of Ithaca, who valued his home, his young wife Penelope, and his newborn son Telemachus far more than the dubious honor of fighting for the unfaithful wife of the Spartan king, decided to evade the call to arms. And the method he chose was telling. He did not contest the decision or try to negotiate. He pretended to be mad. The envoys, among whom was the cunning Palamedes, arrive in Ithaca and see the king harnessing an ox and a donkey to a plow, animals with different gaits, which made plowing impossible. But the height of this theater of the absurd was that Odysseus sowed his field not with wheat, but with salt. It was an act of utter madness, for salt makes the earth barren. He hoped that they would consider him insane and leave him alone. But Palamedes, whose cunning was equal to Odysseus's, decided to test him. He snatched the infant Telemachus from Penelope's arms and placed him directly in front of the plow. The calculation was simple. No father, even the most insane, would run over his own son. Odysseus, seeing that his ruse had been exposed, stopped the plow abruptly. His simulation had failed. This episode reveals two key traits of his character. First, his willingness to resort to any deception to avoid responsibility and duty. He is not just a dodger, he is an actor, ready to put on a whole performance. Second, and more importantly, he harbored a deadly grudge against someone who turned out to be smarter than him. Palamedes did not simply expose Odysseus, he humiliated him by revealing the limits of his cunning. And the king of Ithaca did not forgive this. Revenge was only a matter of time. Years later, already at the walls of Troy, Odysseus put his plan into action. He wrote a fake letter on behalf of the Trojan king Priam addressed to Palamedes, which spoke of betrayal and promised gold. Then he bribed one of the Trojan prisoners to lose this letter in the Achaean camp. At the same time, Odysseus's henchmen planted a bag of gold in Palamedes' tent. When the letter was found and read before the council of leaders, and the Trojan gold was discovered in the tent, Palamedes' fate was sealed. He was accused of treason and, by the verdict of the Achaean kings, stoned to death. Odysseus did not simply eliminate his rival, he did it with someone else's hands, maintaining the appearance of justice and mourning the traitor along with everyone else. It was a cold, calculated, and utterly ruthless reprisal, motivated not by military necessity, but by wounded pride. But even before this fateful moment, his contribution to the war had been marred by morally questionable actions. It was Odysseus who was sent with Menelaus to the island of Skyros to find Achilles. The mother of the great warrior, Thetis, knowing of the prophecy that her son would die at Troy, hid him among the daughters of King Lycomedes, dressing him in women's clothing.
Odysseus, arriving at the court disguised as a merchant, laid out his wares before the princesses: fabrics, jewelry, and, next to them, weapons. Then, at his signal, the sound of a battle trumpet rang out from beyond the palace walls. All the girls screamed in fear, and only one of them instinctively grabbed a sword. Thus Achilles gave himself away. Odysseus once again used deception to draw a young man, whom his own mother was trying to save, into a deadly war. He acted like a recruiter for whom the fate of an individual is nothing compared to the task at hand. Another episode, often omitted from heroic retellings, is the story of Iphigenia, daughter of Agamemnon. When the Achaean fleet was stuck in Aulis due to a lack of wind, the seer Calchas announced that the goddess Artemis demanded the commander-in-chief's daughter as a sacrifice. Agamemnon was in despair. And who was sent to deceive Iphigenia into coming to the camp? Odysseus. He went to her mother, Clytemnestra, and lied that the girl was to be married to the great Achilles. The delighted mother sent her daughter to Aulis, straight to the sacrificial altar. Odysseus here acts as a heartless executor, ready to lie to the mother's face and condemn an innocent girl to death for the sake of a favorable wind. His pragmatism knows no moral boundaries. During the siege of Troy, Odysseus became famous not only as a strategist, but also as a spy and saboteur. Together with Diomedes, he made a night raid on the Trojan camp. Their goal was to kill the Thracian king Rhesus and steal his magical horses, which, according to legend, would make Troy impregnable if they drank water from the local river. On the way, they captured the Trojan spy Dolon, who, under torture, revealed the location of Rhesus' camp. Having obtained the information, Diomedes cold-bloodedly cut Dolon's throat. Then they entered the tent of the sleeping Rhesus, killed him and 12 of his warriors, and stole the horses. It was a brilliant diversionary operation, but in essence it was a nighttime massacre of sleeping people, devoid of any military nobility. Even his famous eloquence often served not to promote peace, but to stir up enmity. In the Iliad, Homer describes a scene in which a simple warrior named Thersites dares to criticize the kings, accusing them of greed and prolonging the war. He speaks the truth, voicing what the whole army is whispering about. But Odysseus, instead of responding to the criticism on its merits, publicly humiliates Thersites. He beats him with his scepter until he bleeds, mocking his ugliness and silencing him to the jeers of the crowd. In this episode, Odysseus appears not as a wise leader, but as a chained dog of power, suppressing any dissent and defending the rotten aristocratic elite. He defends not the right cause, but the corporate interests of the robber kings. Let us return to his wanderings. The story of Philoctetes, the keeper of Heracles' bow, deserves special attention. At the beginning of the campaign, the Achaeans abandoned him on the uninhabited island of Lemnos because he had been bitten by a snake and the wound exuded such a foul odor that no one could stay near him. For 10 years Philoctetes survived alone, suffering from pain and cursing his former comrades, especially Odysseus, who was the initiator of this decision. But at the end of the war, a prophecy said that Troy could not be taken without Heracles' bow. And who was sent for Philoctetes? Odysseus again. He understood that Philoctetes would never willingly help those who had betrayed him. Therefore, he devised another cunning plan. He took the young Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, with him and persuaded him to deceive the unfortunate recluse. Neoptolemus was to pretend that he too had quarreled with the Achaean leaders and, having gained Philoctetes' trust, steal his bow. The plan almost succeeded. The honest young man, tormented by his conscience, deceived the sufferer and took possession of the weapon. But at the last moment, his conscience prevailed. He refused to follow Odysseus's plan and returned the bow to Philoctetes.
The intervention of the deified Heracles, who appeared from heaven, forced Philoctetes to go to Troy after all. But this myth reveals Odysseus's baseness. He is ready to manipulate not only his enemies, but also the pure soul of a young man, using his nobility for his own dirty purposes. He is not just a liar, he is a corrupter for whom nothing is sacred. Even his relationship with the gods is transactional rather than pious. His patroness Athena is the goddess of wisdom, but also the goddess of military cunning. Their alliance is not that of a believer and a deity, but a partnership between two cynical pragmatists. Odysseus does not pray to Athena for justice, he asks her for advice on how best to deceive and win. He treats the gods as powerful resources that can and should be used. At the same time, as we saw in the example of Poseidon, he is not afraid to incur their wrath if his own vanity is at stake. And so he arrives in Ithaca. The kingdom is in ruins, the nobility has been killed, and the people are divided. What does a wise ruler do? He tries to heal the wounds and unite the people. But Odysseus, according to some post-Homeric texts, cannot stop. His restless nature, his evil genius, demands new adventures. In his Divine Comedy, Dante Alighieri places Ulysses, the Roman name for Odysseus, in the 8th circle of hell, in the pit for deceitful counselors. There, Ulysses recounts that neither love for his son, nor duty to his old father, nor Penelope's fidelity could keep him at home. He equipped a ship again and set off beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the unknown ocean in pursuit of knowledge and valor. He enticed his last elderly companions, promising them glory, and led them to certain death. This final voyage, which ended in shipwreck and the death of all, becomes for Dante a symbol of the pride of the human mind, which, unrestrained by morality, leads to self-destruction. Odysseus appears not simply as a tyrant, but as a seducer, a false prophet, luring souls into the abyss. His cruelty also took more subtle psychological forms. Recall his encounter with Nausicaa, the young princess of the Phaeacians. He appears before her naked, emaciated, covered in sea salt, a pitiful sight. But his speech is a masterpiece of manipulation. He compares her to the goddess Artemis, flatters her beauty and status, evoking pity and admiration at the same time. He plays on the strings of the maiden's soul with the skill of a virtuoso. He gets everything he needs: clothes, food, hospitality, and a ship to return home. But what does he leave behind? He leaves behind a girl who has obviously fallen in love with him. Her farewell words are full of quiet sadness. "Remember me in your homeland, for you owe your life to me." Odysseus, of course, promises to remember, but we understand that for him it was just another episode, another resource that he used and discarded. He bears no responsibility for the broken hearts he leaves in his wake. He is an emotional predator, taking what he needs and not thinking about the consequences for others. Even his famous homesickness, if you look closely, seems ambiguous. Yes, he weeps on the shore of the island of Ogygia, where he has been held captive for 7 years by the nymph Calypso. But what exactly is he mourning? Homer says he longs for return. But for the king, returning is not just about reuniting with his family. It is about regaining power, status, and wealth. He spends 7 years in a paradise with an immortal goddess who offers him eternal youth. Most mortals would consider this a gift. But Odysseus refuses. Not because he is so devoted to Penelope, after all he shared his bed with both Calypso and Circe without hesitation, but because immortality, as the goddess's eternal lover, is a golden cage. It is a life without purpose, without struggle, without power. He prefers the mortal life of a king on rocky Ithaca to the immortal life of a prince consort. His loyalty to his home is loyalty to his role, to his ego, to his place at the top of the social hierarchy. Consider his attitude towards his own son, Telemachus. When they meet after 20 years of separation, Odysseus does not waste time on paternal feelings. He immediately gets down to business, laying out his plan for revenge. He uses Telemachus as his lieutenant, as a tool in his war. He tests him, gives him cruel orders, drags him into a bloody massacre that changes the young man forever. The scene where Telemachus, on his own initiative, decides to hang the maidservants rather than kill them with a sword, so that the shameful ones do not end their lives with a clean death, is a terrible moment. The son tries to surpass his father in cruelty, to prove his maturity to him. Odysseus does not teach him mercy, justice, or the wisdom of a ruler. He teaches him to take revenge, to kill, and to trust no one. He does not raise an heir, he creates a copy of himself, a successor to his tyranny. Finally, the deepest layer of his personality is his attitude towards his own identity. His famous "I am nobody" in Polyphemus's cave is not just a military ruse, it is his credo. Odysseus is a master of disguise. He is a beggar, a merchant, a hero, a storyteller, anyone depending on the situation. He is so accustomed to wearing masks that the question arises, is there a real face underneath them? He lies not only to his enemies, but also to his allies, his wife, his father. Lying becomes second nature to him. He tells the Phaeacians a thrilling story of his adventures, but can we be sure that it is all true? Has he embellished his exploits or kept silent about the most shameful moments? He is the author of his own myth, the first PR manager in history, who creates a heroic image from a series of highly questionable deeds. In this light, his final confrontation with the relatives of the murdered suitors takes on new meaning. They come not simply to seek revenge. Their leader, Epeius, Antinous' father, addresses the people of Ithaca with an accusation. This man has destroyed the flower of our people. First, he took the best of them away on ships and destroyed them all at Troy. And now, having returned, he has killed the most noble here. This is not just the cry of despair of a grief-stricken father. It is a political accusation. Odysseus is accused of destroying the gene pool, the aristocracy, the future of Ithaca. First in a senseless overseas war, and then in a civil massacre. And this accusation is justified. Odysseus's reign, which began with deception, led his kingdom to demographic and social catastrophe. And only the intervention of the gods, Deus ex machina, saves him from the righteous anger of the people. He remains king not by right, but by divine caprice. His throne is based not on the love of his subjects, but on fear and supernatural power. His attitude towards the divine will is also selective and utilitarian. When the prophecies or the will of the gods coincide with his desires, he becomes their zealous executor. But when they contradict his plans, he looks for ways to circumvent or ignore them. Recall the story of the bulls of the god Helios on the island of Trinacria. Both the blind prophet Tiresias in Hades and the sorceress Circe sternly warned Odysseus, "Do not touch the bulls, or you and your crew will perish." It was a direct and unambiguous taboo. Odysseus passed this prohibition on to his men. But what happens next? Due to unfavorable winds, they are stuck on the island for a whole month. Food supplies run out, and hunger becomes unbearable. Instead of acting as a leader and looking for a way out or maintaining discipline, Odysseus retreats deep into the island to pray to the gods and falls asleep there. In his absence, the exhausted crew, incited by Eurylochus, decides to commit sacrilege. They kill and eat the sacred animals. When Odysseus wakes up and learns what has happened, he is horrified and blames the gods, who sent him into a sweet sleep. This is a classic technique of shifting responsibility. He, the captain, abandoned his post at the most critical moment. His authority was not enough to keep people from taking this fateful step. He did not share their hunger, but distanced himself, and in the end, his inaction caused the death of his last companions.
When their ship was destroyed by Zeus's lightning bolt, Odysseus survived alone, clinging to the wreckage of the mast. Fate seemed to emphasize that he was the only one who bore personal responsibility. But the punishment for his failure was borne by everyone except himself. Even his famous resourcefulness, on closer inspection, often turns out to be simple treachery. In the Iliad, there is a little-known episode where the Achaeans suffer from hunger. Odysseus and Diomedes go on a reconnaissance mission and meet King Aeneas, a priest of Apollo, and his daughters. These girls had a divine gift from Dionysus. One turned everything she touched into wine, another into grain, and the third into olive oil. Odysseus, assessing their strategic value, did not negotiate. He simply kidnapped them and brought them by force to the Achaean camp to feed the army. This act was not just kidnapping, but sacrilege, violence against a priest of an allied god. The girls begged Dionysus for salvation, and the god, taking pity on them, turned them into doves. Odysseus once again demonstrated that nothing was sacred to him, neither the priesthood, nor female honor, nor the will of the gods, if practical gain was at stake. His intellectual superiority, of which he is so proud, also has a dark side. It breeds a deep contempt for those who do not possess his intelligence and cunning. This is evident in his attitude towards the simple soldier, his rowers, and the simple-minded Polyphemus. He does not see them as his equals. To him, they are either obstacles to be removed or resources to be exploited. This intellectual arrogance, which has grown into the dehumanization of those around him, is the root of his tyranny. He rules not because he loves his people, but because he considers himself the only one worthy of ruling, the only one who knows how it should be done. This trait is particularly evident in his treatment of his loyal swineherd Eumaeus.
Upon his return to Ithaca, Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, finds shelter with him. Odysseus certainly remains a controversial figure. His cunning and courage do not negate the cruelty and tyrannical traits hidden in the myths. Revisiting these stories, we see that the image of a hero can mask the dark side of power, calling for a more critical view of ancient legends. Perhaps this is the main lesson. Even the greatest myths need to be re-evaluated. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and see you again in the world of myths and their hidden truths.